Hi, and welcome back to the Church Renewal Podcast. I'm your host, Alan Edwards with Flourish Coaching. Flourish exists to set ministry leaders free with the gospel to be effective wherever God has called them. On this episode of the podcast, we're talking to Pastor Mike Khandjian. Mike is a PCA pastor in the Baltimore area. He's been featured in George Barna's book, Turnaround Churches. He's written his own volume, A Sometimes Stumbling Life, and he's been called a pastor to pastors. Today, we'll ask Mike about what it takes to turn around a church and what are some of the common spiritual and emotional struggles that pastors face as they try to lead healthy churches. Join us for this conversation as we dig into the ways that Jesus is renewing his church. Mike, welcome to the Church Renewal Podcast. We're glad to have you today, brother.
It's great to be here, Alan. Thanks for having me.
And like almost all other forms of communication here in 2020, we're doing this over Zoom, right?
Right. Yeah, this is our new reality.
This is it. Everybody for me exists in this like 2x4-inch box. And I've gotten to see.
I was talking with someone today that said, why can't we just talk on the phone again? So anyways.
I do worry more about like I'm in a room with a lot of backlighting right now. So you probably just see like the shadow of my face, like Dr. Claw from Inspector Gadget.
Yeah, exactly. Great movie.
Yeah.
Robert Downey Jr.
Yeah, right. Filmed in Pittsburgh. I'm a Pittsburgh guy. You're a Baltimore guy. We don't hold that against each other. It's all good.
No, not at all. Go Raiders.
That's right. All right. So we've got Mike on the podcast for our audience today. Mike has been an encouragement to me personally in my life and to many pastors in the tradition that I worked in the PCA. But some of our readers who are some of our listeners rather, who like to explore the literature around church renewal and church revitalization might remember a book from the early 90s, late 80s from George Barna called Turnaround Churches. And in it, Barna really argued that it's really rare for a church that is struggling to turn around. Now, there's been a ton of research and a ton of lit that has come since then. But one of the churches that Barna studied at the time was pastored by our guest today, Mike. And so, Mike, we'll call this a deep cut. But can you give me like just like the brief, how did you see God use you in your ministry? You know, this is now 30 years ago or so, to see a church go from struggling to healthier. Like, what was that experience like? How did you see God working through that experience?
Alan, I would say that our experience in Tallahassee, which is when that book was written, was really a beautiful experience. It was incredibly difficult because it was an ingrown small church when we went. And that meant overcoming a lot of obstacles of people dynamics, kind of the big fish in the little pond and stuff like that. And I can honestly tell you, I made so many mistakes, did so many things wrong, was so immature that for God's own reasons, his spirit, he decided by his spirit to bless that church, because I was pretty clueless. We were 28 when we went to it.
Wow.
And God just gave us grace to hang in there, to be faithful as much as we knew, and to have a vision for what that church could be in a college town. And it just was blessed beyond our wildest dreams.
Yeah. Now, you came from Tallahassee to your current call in the Baltimore area. Is that right?
Actually, I went home for 10 years to my home church and pastored there. So I was in Tallahassee for 10 years and then my home church in Miami. And we've been here for almost 15 years. So it's been a really wonderful experience. They've all been wonderful experiences. I don't say that pie in the sky. We've made so many mistakes, and yet in those mistakes, God's grace has shined really brightly.
Yeah. So we would say, I think the research suggests that 10 years is what we would call a long-term call or a long-term pastorate. A lot of folks turn over far before that. So you've had 3 pretty significant long-term pastorates. As you look back over those 3, has what would you, after these three pretty significantly long pastorates, what would you describe as a healthy church? Like, what are the things that make a local congregation healthy in terms of mission, in terms of even just like the culture? So you've gotten these three long-term looks at churches. After that, looking back, what makes a church healthy for you?
Well, that's a great question. Obviously, we would say Jesus is king in that church, and I don't say that lightly, because churches that are in decline, they 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 subtly lose sight of the fact that that the that the vision is Jesus and His rule in a church. Um, so there are different factors. There is a gospel centered message and community. There's a healthy leadership. There is a prevailing honesty that enables us to enter into the broken places in that church and address them lovingly. And there is a willingness to start fresh, to to respectfully start fresh, to get permission from the people who have been there to start fresh. And I think the key in each case, because in each case there's been one uh, uh, consistent theme, and that is that in the interview process, we were willing to say, this is where your church is and this is what you need. And if you're willing to enter into this, then let's go forward. Because people don't, we've had conflicts after going to churches. And I've been able to say, now, I understand why you're disappointed about this or upset, but this is what we talked about when we interviewed. Yeah. So if we're going to be here, this is what we need to do. And it's okay if you don't want us to be here. Like at Chapelgate, where we are now, which has been just an absolutely beautiful experience. We have what's called the 6-week in meeting. And the 6-week in meeting is that the church had a very formal, choir and orchestra and stuff like that. That was kind of along the lines of cantata sort of era. And then it got a music guy that led it in a little more blended direction. And when we got here, they thought we would take it back to what it was. But in the interview process, we said, no, that's not what we're going to do. That would not be good, because they had lost hundreds of young adults at the church in a period of about 5 years. So when the folks who wanted the old kind of traditional 60s to 80s traditional, or 50s to 80s traditional, thinking that it would go back, they asked for a meeting, and about 200 people crowded into this room, and they kind of yelled at me the whole time. And I said, listen, it's okay if you don't want me to be here. I'm okay with that. But if I'm here, this is what we're going to do, because that's what we said we would do. And that's what I think this church needs. And we got through that, and many of them left, but then many came back. But the Lord blessed it. And I'll tell you, the key in all these situations has been supportive leaders, elders, sessions, deacons, volunteer leaders, lay leaders, who are willing to hang in there until it makes total sense to them. So it's a huge trust. And of course, the Spirit of God has to make it happen.
Yeah. So I feel like I'm hearing a couple themes here. I'm hearing the theme of Christ at the center, the gospel at the center of ministry, an honesty from both the pastor and from the church about here's where we are. I hear like the idea of like pre-agreement. I think a lot of pastors are in a hurry to get a call, and I think a lot of churches are in a hurry to get a pastor. But you talked about, hey, before I come here, I'm going to tell you what I think, and I'm going to tell you what I'm going to do. And then, if you don't like me, but we talked about it. So this kind of pre-agreement. And then that last piece I heard, that last theme was healthy leadership. I think a lot of pastors that I interact with have a vision for how things could be, but they don't know how to bring their leaders with them. Do you have any advice from your experience about how do you either bring your leaders with you or help them find their way off the bus. Jim Collins says that old thing: get the right people on the bus, get the right people off the bus, and get the right people in the right seats on the bus. Like, what are just some like basic things guys can do to help their leaders like that?
So I always go by what Jesus says to the church, to one of the churches in Revelation: strengthen the things that remain. And how that translates to me is that your guys have to know that you respect them. They have to know that you understand that this is a big process and it doesn't have to happen overnight, but that you have to be resolute in doing this. And so getting them on board is getting to know them, loving them, communicating with them. 6 months after we got or 3 months after we got to Chapelgate to Maryland, I wrote the famous, now it's infamous, 57-page paper on what I thought we needed to do and shift and fix and fought through it with the elders. We didn't fight. It was a great experience. And then we presented it together to the congregation. And frankly, we've just finished working off of that 57-page paper. In other words, in layers, everything that we hope to do. We've got a seminary. We're building a sanctuary. We're involving women in a more active role in our leadership expression. We've and all these and many others were along the lines of communicating in advance, but also respecting the fact that they have been somewhere that you haven't been with them, and helping them to go to the next place.
Yeah, it reminds me. A friend of mine was in manufacturing leadership, and he said that if people, well, I'll clean up his language, but that it takes 10 pats on the back for every time you call someone. I don't know how to clean up the language, so I just won't say what he said. But I mean, but there has to be a building of mutual trust and respect before folks are necessarily going to be going with you. That doesn't mean you stop your vision, right?
That's right. The thing is that these people are friends with each other, and they're not your friend at first. They want to respect you. They want to be your friend. They want to all these things. But the truth is that, especially early on, they know that they're going to be here. And as committed as they are to being faithful to the scriptures and leading the church, they're not going to just obliterate all their friendships at the expense of, they're not going to follow the pastor at the expense of their relationships. It's got to make a lot of sense to them. They've got to believe that not only does the pastor love them, but he even loves those that are going to disagree with them, and that he loves the church. When we hire people, Alan, we say we've got 3 rules at this church if you're going to be on staff. Number 1, you have to care. If you don't care, you can't keep your job here. You don't have to be the best. In fact, you're probably not. None of us are. But you do have to care. That means that if I fall down, you have to help me up, and that kind of thing. Number 2, really the number 1 is, but I'll put it number 2 here, is that our people, we're here for them. They're not here for us. If there's ever a time when our people feel like you are making them feel guilty for not taking care of you, you can't be here. You're here for them. With no sheep, there's no need for the. And number 3 is, we love you, but we love Jesus more, and we love this church more. So with the elders need to believe that. They need to believe that we care for those that they've been called to care for.
Yeah. Yeah, that's beautiful, man. I can see why, and I don't know how you'll feel about this, but I can see why people call you a pastor to pastors. Because these are the reflections. I mean, I feel like a lot of guys get, especially in the tradition that you and I have been in the Reformed and evangelical community, a lot of guys get out of seminary with one of two hats on. You've probably heard this. They either have the gospel cowboy hat on, do whatever it takes to advance the kingdom. And sometimes those guys really frustrate the leaders in their church because they're just so laser focused on let's do everything we can to reach the lost. Not a bad impulse, right? But can have some damage in the wake. Other guys come out of seminary and they've got that, people jokingly say the heresy hunter hat on, but they're going to come in and they're going to get that church doing everything jot and tittle, perfect and right. And while their impulse might be out of a place of love for God and his word, it can leave a lot of damage in the wake. So what I'm hearing you reflect on is, I think, why people have said to me that Mike Khandjian's a pastor to pastors, because it seems to me to reflect a really beautiful balance between those impulses of we're going to do what we have to do to be faithful to Jesus and the mission of this church, but we're going to do it in a way that respects and understands the situation on the ground and the people on the ground before we jump into it. Can we lean into that little moniker for a minute more, though? This idea of being a pastor to pastors. When you survey the landscape of guys coming into ministry today, guys who are just coming in or 5-10 years in, what do you feel like are some of the common themes or common struggles you see in young pastors? And the reason I'm asking is that at Flourish, we always say it takes a healthy pastor to pastor a healthy church. Do you see any themes or patterns in the guys that you've ministered to in the ministry over the last 10 years?
I think they're far more informed than I ever was. I mean, they're really brilliant young men. I love them and look up to them. Maybe that they're more connected. When I was in seminary, there was no internet, there were no cell phones. So,
they just come out with photography for the first time when you were in seminary, right?
Exactly. And that the etchings on that shiny paper, but but I see good things. I see a bright future, Alan. These guys they're hungry, they're excited. That I hear complaints among my generations, like all I want to do is sit around at Starbucks and smoke a pipe. But they really work at Starbucks when they're there, and I think that they, some of maybe the place where there's the need, that the reason it's good for some of us older guys to be here, and not because we're older, but because we've been in ministry longer, is that the people dimension to ministry is so vital. The common sense, how you deal with people and that kind of thing. But I just see mostly good things. I've been blessed by the young men that have come to our church. They've been an encouragement to me, and I learn from them. We let them preach a lot. I like to be there when they do, because they feed me and Catherine, my wife, and I think the church has got a bright future.
Yeah. So on that people dimension, I don't know if you'll remember this, but peeling back the curtain here a few minutes, I did an event with Mike a few years back, and in between sessions or something, I was sharing a story I had. This is when I was pastoring, and I said I shared with Mike that I was really having trouble with a couple people in the church, and that my emotions toward them were really negative. I just really did not like them, and I was supposed to be taking care of them, and one of them was in leadership. And Mike, I don't know if you'll remember this, but you said to me, Alan, you are going to have a real hard time moving forward until you go and get before the Lord and you are honest with the Lord about how you feel about these families in your church. That rocked my world. And a couple times I went and sat in the sanctuary of my church, and I started to be honest with the Lord about how I felt. And I literally got up and walked away because I did not want to talk to the Lord about my feelings. So on this people dimension, Mike, do you see interpersonal conflict that pastors have with their congregations? How do you see that impacting pastors' lives? Why did you tell me to go be honest with the Lord about my feelings?
Well, because I like I said, I've learned a lot out of my own failures. I think we live in that tension, Alan, between what we think we're supposed to be and who we really are. And we get disappointed with ourselves, and think that if we don't say it, that it won't be so, but it is so. And as a result, we put on the right face, but then we don't treat people the way we should. Um, yeah, what do I see? I see a lot of loneliness.
Mm.
Guys that are lonely, guys that have leaders that are very hard and uh, are quick. And I'm blessed to not have this where I am. So I want you to know this isn't a asking for a friend kind of thing, but guys who their leaders are just constantly dissatisfied with them, who are checking every jot and tittle, who are very critical of them, who don't pay them, and they're lonely. They don't feel like they don't feel like they have anyone there for them. I called a guy in another state that was in this kind of fellowship that I sort of shepherd, and I just wanted to check on him, and because I knew he was struggling with loneliness. And he answers the phone, and he says, "Why did you call me?" And I said, "Well, I just wanted to make sure you're okay." And he said, "Well, thank you." He said, "I'm out of the ministry. I couldn't do it anymore." I showed up at a church that my family was familiar with, and the pastor was running in and out, and I could tell that he was really struggling. And we talked for a while, and he told me all the big initiatives he was pushing for and hoping for, and his face wasn't saying the same thing his mouth was saying. And I looked at him and I just said, "Ministry is so hard, isn't it?" And I thought he was going to cry. He goes, "Yeah, it is." And I said, "You're not the only one. Why don't I pray for you?" And I just prayed with him. So I hear a lot of loneliness and discouragement. Um, I we all know the language when a guy starts telling you only good things, you get a little concerned for them. We've seen so many self-inflicted deaths in the past 5 years of pastors who have attained that status,
Mm.
so I think there has to be a different message out there to the
Yeah.
guys.
Yeah. I've heard you say throughout our time today that you've learned from your own mistakes and failures along the way. And that calls to mind the title of your book, available on Amazon.com. Mike is not paying for this episode, but I'm going to plug it for him anyway. It's called A Sometimes Stumbling Life. And in it, you write that when we live in hiding, we're lying to God, to ourselves, and to everyone else. Why is it so important? I mean, for all Christians, but really, why is it important for ministry leaders and pastors to come out of hiding and be real with God about who they are and be real with themselves about who they are?
I think it's important because when we live in hiding, the 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 person that our people see is not who they can ever be. It's
Mm.
not real. I mean, it hurts us, of course, but that's not where our people are. We had a guy who's suspended from ministry, who was caught plagiarizing, and he's a great friend, and he preached at our church about 3 weeks ago. It's one of the best sermons I've ever heard. He told our congregation what he had done and how he had dealt with it. He talked about his brokenness, and he preached out of Psalm 34:18. The Lord is near to those who are broken in heart and saves those who are contrite, crushed in spirit. And he spoke out of his brokenness. He came out of hiding. And it was like one of the most healing messages any of us had ever heard. It was just absolutely beautiful. And Eugene Peterson speaks to this in his book Leap Over a Wall, and his devotional book about David, which I'd recommend to everybody on earth. But he says that David's Psalms were great, but they were amazing after he got caught in his sin with Bathsheba and what he did with Uriah. And the brokenness and God's graciousness in his life, his loving kindness, really came out. So when we're in hiding, it's back to that being who we think we're supposed to be. Um, and to be sure, there are people in the church who prefer that. Whenever I pray before I preach. I ask God to speak the gospel into our lives in spite of the insufficiencies, insecurities, sins, and failures of the one who preaches. And one Sunday, 1 week after that in Miami, one of the elders came in and said, "Mike, I don't like it when you say that." And I said, "Well, why not?" He said, I just don't like it. And I said, "But Jack, it's true. It's true. I'm a big sinner, and it's okay for me to say that. In fact, I have to say that. But it's hard for some people. But that's who we are, and that's who our people are. Our people are struggling. They're broken. Their marriages aren't what they appear to be on Sundays all the time. They could have World War VII in the car and they walk into church. Everybody looks like a Christian.
Yeah, everybody put on your happy face. Yeah,
absolutely. So once you cross that Rubicon and say, "This is who I am," your people know they're dealing with the real deal, and that's who they are.
Yeah, that's a good word, brother. So as we kind of come to the time we have for the podcast today, at Flourish, we say that all churches are in need of renewal in the gospel. Some churches are in need of acute revitalization. They're facing statistical significant decline. And that kind of work, a lot of guys, to borrow a word from the title of your book, a lot of guys stumble into that situation. They didn't go looking for it. They went to a church and they realized it later. They realized either that there's kind of a staleness in the culture, or they realize, oh, I didn't realize that we were bleeding that badly. There are guys, I think, there are guys that really intentionally say, I want to turn around a church. I want to help a church get healthy again. But like all pastoral ministry, it can be lonely work. It's not as refreshing necessarily as working with college students, new students every 4 years in your college ministry. It's not necessarily as, if I can say, sexy as church planting. I'm doing something new. I'm raising money. It's really exciting. We're going to a new place. It can be unsung hero work. Do you have any encouragements as we kind of wrap up today for folks who are laboring to see a church move from a place where it's become stale to a fresh experience of the gospel, or for guys who are really trying to turn around a church facing significant decline? Could you just give us a little bit of encouragement, Pastor?
Yeah, I think what I would say is, and it kind of meshes with the last thing you asked about. Because when we're not ourselves, we become monsters. We hurt our families. They know that it's different from what they see on Sundays. We hurt the people we love the most. So what I would say is just minister within who you are. You were redeemed to be one person, and it's you. You're not the best. One person is the best, and maybe it's you. But the best person that church can possibly have on the planet is the one that God called there. And that means that, you're going to preach a few dogs, you're going to make a lot of mistakes, you're going to have a few regrets, but be who you are. Be who God redeemed you to be and who he called you to be. He called you to be there. Preach the word faithfully, preach the gospel faithfully, and trust the gospel. Trust the Spirit to do his work. We don't turn churches around, God does. And either he wants to turn that church around or he doesn't. He's the one that blows out the candles. He's the one that keeps them flickering. So be who you are, because who you are the one that the Father delights in. And, it doesn't mean there won't be disappointments, but I've seen the perfect pastor dive bomb.
Yeah.
We're just who we are. Our limitations are real. Our aspirations just need to be to please the Father. He's the one that delights in us. And the Lord will take care of the rest.
Yeah. Well, that's a good word. Thanks so much, Mike. And thank you all to our listeners for tuning into the podcast today. Mike Khandjian is the pastor of Chapel Gate Presbyterian Church outside of Baltimore. He's the author of A Sometimes Stumbling Life, and he is an encouragement to almost everybody that the Lord brings across his path. Mike, thank you so much for joining us today.
Alan, thank you. And thank you for what you all are doing at Flourish.
Thank you. Thanks. If you want to learn more about the work of Flourish Coaching and Church Renewal, visit us at flourishcoaching.org or find us on Facebook, facebook.com/flourishcoach1. We'd love to interact with you. You know, we do this work, we record these episodes, we do this work with churches because there is only one fully sufficient reason that this day dawned, and that is that Jesus is yet gathering a people to himself, and the ordinary way he does that is through the work and ministry of the local church. So join us next time as we dig into the ways that Jesus is renewing his church.